couple of weeks ago, I released a video introducing my latest project, an 1860s ensemble that I'm calling the Berry Dress. This concept is built upon a thought I had. What exactly would I wear to a historical fancy dress party? And ultimately, I decided I would want to look like a berry. Since I finished the skirt portion of the ensemble during the last video, there are 3 more pieces of the garment to complete. This episode today will be the process of construction for the Swiss waist, which is also sometimes referred to as a sash. The pattern I used for this one is by Truly Victorian. I really like Truly Victorian patterns, I must say. They're extremely simple to use and they offer up lovely results. This pattern has 2 separate views, and so I took to my patrons over at Patreon to decide whether I should construct view A or view B. They ultimately chose view B, and I'm really happy with their decision. If you would like to be a part of making decisions like these in the future and receive even more perks, be sure to click the link in the card. To begin with, I had to decide on fabric. I went with this thick black linen I had in my stash. It is so thick that it almost has the consistency of canvas. Since this is a lace-up garment, I wanted it to have a lot of support, so I felt that this was the best material. I decided as well to interline the accessory with a second layer of this black linen, just in case. The outer fabric is this gorgeous pink and red shot silk. In one direction the threads are red and in the other they're pink, which is what gives it this changing, iridescent quality that I feel mimics a berry superbly. I found this on a sale, so it's not only beautiful, but it was also incredibly affordable. The first step was cutting out the lining pieces. I went ahead and traced them all out from some tracing paper copies I made, and then proceeded to cut. I accidentally ended up cutting out a side front piece instead of the actual piece I needed, a center front piece, so I basically got the pieces for 2 different views a bit mixed up, but eventually I managed to sort it out, and after I had all the correct pieces cut for the lining, I proceeded to baste them together, just so I could get a feel for the fit and check if it would even work on my measurements, almost as if to serve as a mock-up of sorts. I felt it fit quite decently, and so I went ahead and traced all of the lining pieces to create copies for the interlining out of the same fabric. Once this was done, I also used the pieces to cut out the outer fabric, then I pinned the interlining and outer fabric layers together, eventually basting them, treating each panel of the belt now as a single entity, even though each panel is technically made up of 2 layers. I took each panel and basted it to its respective panel in order to get it prepared for sewing. Then, using small back stitches, each panel was joined to the next, so that there were 8 panels now in total to make up the belt. All of these seams are ultimately what gives this belt its flattering and body-conforming shape. The hardest part was actually next, tucking under all of the seam allowances and finishing them so that they look neat. Those strange curves and edges were not easy at all to work with. I pressed open the seam allowances and notched the curves to ease them a bit. I also trimmed down the interlining layer for less bulk, and then it was time to secure the lining. First, I notched the curves of the lining pieces, otherwise there was no way they would attach neatly. Then it was really just a slow and painstaking process. Little by little, I had to fold under the seam allowances and pin the layer down, manipulating the curves and edges as much as possible in order to get them to look neat. This is one of those tasks that you initially think is going to go quickly, but then once you're actually there completing it, it ends up being far more difficult than it initially seemed. I had to sort of accomplish this part of the process in chunks. Basically, I completed part of the belt and then came back to the rest later, so you'll see it here being done in stages as well. Now that I had some of the lining pinned, I decided to work on the bones that give the accessory even more support. I have a tendency to make my own boning channels because I don't often like the steel boning used in many of the pre-made options. In this case, I decided to use thin zip ties since I had some handy already. I measured each seam where I wanted the bone to be. For the center front one, I decided the bone would be about 5 inches, then I trimmed the zip tie down to that size. I proceeded to file the sharp edge down so that it wouldn't poke through the twill tape using an old nail file, and you can see here the result is much better. The other end is the factory made one and it's already blunt, so I didn't need to do anything. Then I cut the twill tape 1 inch longer than the bone, and I repeated this twice so that there were 2 pieces of twill tape. This is the same twill tape that I used to secure the hem of the skirt. I wanted that similarity and continuity. Finally, I backstitched one end shut, right side to right side, flipped the tape open, pinned one side shut, added in the zip tie, pinned the other side shut, and began sewing everything together using small but messy whip stitches. I repeated this process 4 more times for a total of 5 bones. These are the locations at which they will be secured once the lining has all been sewn down. After that little detour was done, it was back to securing the lining. I did a lot more pinning, and once more than half of it was secured, I went ahead and stitched this all down using whip stitches, making sure nothing would show on the right side of the garment by placing each stitch right into the seam allowance fold. There was just a small section now left, and it was time to finally complete it. It was so satisfying once it was all done. The next step of the process was creating the eyelets. Initially I thought I'd maybe use metal grommets, but I've never really worked with them before and I'm a lot more comfortable with hand stitching, so I instead decided just to hand sew them with whip stitches. I marked all the holes first, 5 for each side, and then proceeded to carefully make the hole using an awl and a lot of pressure. Due to all of the thick layers, this was actually a bit of a tricky process, and it was even a bit of a workout in the end. It really helped when I pinned all the layers together before using the awl, because it just kept everything still. Then it was a lot of whip stitching, and finally 10 eyelets were done. I like how each one is a little different and looks a bit wonky. I think it gives a personal touch and shows the imperfection and the humanness of all of us. I also went with a green contrasting thread for a nice pop of color. Finally, it was time for one of the last steps, the decorations. I knew this would be the chance for the Swiss waist to really exemplify the berry theme. I decided I would create a series of silk bows from the same chartreuse fabric, and then add berry details to each of these bows and pin them to the back of the Swiss waist at the sash portions. To do so, I started by cutting strips of the chartreuse silk and then pinked all the edges so they wouldn't fray as much. My pinking shears are vintage, so they're very stiff and difficult to use because they need to be oiled, so I sadly ended up giving myself quite the blister after making dozens of these strips. After all the strips were pinked, I took one and folded it so that the edges would meet at the center back of the future bow. Then I ran a quick gathering stitch and pulled it tight, securing this with a series of knots. Now you can see the bow is really starting to take shape. I took a smaller piece of pinked fabric and folded under the edges to make it smaller, then wrapped this around the bow at the center and sewed it together at the back. Then I took a third strip, folded it in half, and cut it with pinking shears. Then I pleated each of the 2 sides and secured them to the bow with quick stitches. These are the streamers coming out of the bow. I think these bows look so incredibly cute, and seeing one made me excited for what the final result would look like. Once all 6 were done, it was time to decorate them a little bit more to fit into the theme. I found these vintage berry buds from the 1940s on Etsy, and they were just perfect for this project. Literally all I had to do was just take a few strands and string them through the opening where the bow centerpiece goes. They stay secure enough that they won't fall out, but I can also remove them eventually if I decide I want to wear the Swiss waist more plain. I also decided to secure the bows onto the Swiss waist with safety pins. This is because at some point I may want to pair this belt with another 1860s ensemble that wouldn't work well with the green and the pink-red combination. So being able to remove the bows when I feel like it makes this Swiss waist far more versatile and wearable as an everyday garment, which is typically my greatest intention with making historical clothing. I secured each bow onto the Swiss waist with a safety pin, spacing 3 out for each side evenly. The only thing left to do now was to secure the boning channels I made earlier. I'm not even completely sure what this stitch I'm using is called, but it's basically just nice X's. Finally, the Swiss waist part was done, and this marks being 50% complete with this project. In all, the Swiss waist took me around 30 hours to finish. It was a surprisingly fiddly and time-consuming construction for such a small accessory. Next week, I will be showing you all how I made the accompanying bonnet. It's my first time ever making a bonnet, so it's one big learning experience, and we'll see how it ends up turning out. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next Thursday for another video.